The morning sun touched the tall glass windows of the university, turning them golden for a moment. Students hurried across the campus with their coffee cups, laughing, calling out to each other and comparing notes before class. Among them walked a boy named Ethan. He wore a faded blue shirt and carried a worn-out backpack that had been stitched in a few places. His shoes were clean but old, the kind that had seen many miles of walking. He walked quietly, his steps careful as if he didn't want to draw any attention. Ethan wasn't the kind of student people noticed. He didn't talk much, didn't join group discussions, and didn't have expensive gadgets or stylish clothes. While most of his classmates came from wealthy families who drove shiny cars or lived in fancy apartments, Ethan lived in a small shared room near the city edge. He took the bus every morning and often skipped lunch just to save a few coins. He had earned a partial scholarship after scoring high marks in his entrance exams. It was his dream to study science, to build things that could make life better for others. But even in a place full of knowledge, it was easy for people like Ethan to feel invisible. His professor, Dr. Callum, was a man who liked order and brilliance. He respected students who spoke confidently, who dressed sharply, and who seemed destined for success. To him, Ethan was just another quiet boy who probably wouldn't go far. He rarely looked in Ethan's direction during lectures, often praising the louder, more polished students instead. One day, Dr. Callum entered the classroom with his usual air of seriousness. "Your research projects are due next week," he announced. "Make sure your work shows real innovation. I don't want to see basic ideas or lazy thinking." The class nodded, some already whispering excitedly about their projects. Ethan listened carefully. He had been planning his project for weeks. His topic was about creating low-cost solar panels using recycled materials. It wasn't fancy, but it mattered deeply to him. His village back home had long struggled with power shortages. He had seen families spend nights in darkness, students like him trying to study under the weak light of candles. He wanted to find a simple way to bring light into homes that couldn't afford electricity. After class, Ethan approached the professor's desk. "Sir," he said softly, "may I ask something about the project requirements?" Dr. Callum barely looked up. "Yes, what is it?" "I was thinking of building a solar panel model using reused materials. I believe it could help reduce costs." The professor interrupted before Ethan could finish. "Reused materials? That sounds more like a recycling project than a research paper. You need to think more academically, not like a school fair." Ethan lowered his gaze. "Yes, sir," he whispered. He walked out slowly, his heart heavy. It wasn't the first time his ideas had been brushed aside. But still, he didn't want to give up. He believed that even small ideas could make a difference if done with care. That evening, Ethan went to his part-time job at a small cafe near the campus. He worked there 4 hours every night, cleaning tables, washing dishes, and sometimes serving customers. His hands were always tired by the time he returned to his room, but he still sat at his desk to work on his project. The desk was just an old wooden table near the window, lit by a dim bulb that flickered now and then. He spread his papers, drew sketches of his solar setup, and wrote down formulas. He collected broken electronic parts from the recycling bins at the lab and bought some cheap materials from the local market. Every time he connected a wire or placed a panel, he imagined the smiles of children studying under bright light. His roommate, Alex, often watched him with a mix of confusion and admiration. "Why are you working so hard for something the professor doesn't even care about?" Alex asked one night. Ethan smiled weakly. "Because I care about it," he said, "even if no one else does." Days turned into nights, and soon it was the week of submission. The classroom buzzed with energy as students carried in their colorful charts, sleek posters, and neatly printed reports. Ethan walked in quietly with a small box containing his solar model and a handwritten report. Its pages neatly bound with string because he couldn't afford printing. When it was his turn to submit, he approached the professor's desk and placed his project there carefully. "Here's my report, sir." Dr. Callum glanced at it briefly, then sighed. "You didn't print it? I told everyone to submit typed and printed copies." "I'm sorry, sir," Ethan said, his voice low. "The printer shop near my place wasn't working last night. But the data and design are all complete." The professor gave a small, uninterested nod. "Fine, leave it there." For a moment, Ethan hesitated, wanting to explain his work, but the professor was already talking to another student. So he stepped back quietly, and returned to his seat. When Dr. Callum reviewed the projects later that day, he spent only a few seconds on Ethan's. The handwritten pages and rough diagrams looked plain compared to others. Basic, he murmured to himself, setting it aside without reading further. Ethan didn't know this yet. He went back to his job that evening, still hopeful. He imagined the professor reading his ideas and maybe finding something valuable in them. But inside the professor's office, his project sat untouched, gathering dust. A few days later, the results were announced. The top students' names were displayed on the notice board. Ethan scanned the list carefully, but his name wasn't there. He smiled faintly, though it hurt. Alex found him standing there. "You didn't make it?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I guess not." "Maybe he didn't understand your idea," Alex said kindly. "Maybe," Ethan replied, forcing a small smile. "But that's okay. I'll keep learning." That night, Ethan went to the rooftop of his building. The city lights twinkled below like stars, but his mind was far away, in the dark streets of his village. He thought of his mother, who had sold homemade crafts to help him pay for books. He thought of the children who still studied under candlelight. He whispered to himself, "One day I'll make it work." Even though he was disappointed, he didn't stop. He decided to redo his experiment with better accuracy. He borrowed lab tools from a kind lab assistant and began working secretly in the corner of the lab after classes. He tested different materials, measured voltage outputs, and took careful notes in his little notebook. He had no fancy equipment, but his patience was his greatest strength. Sometimes he stayed so late that the security guard had to remind him the lab was closing. One evening, as he packed his things, he saw Dr. Callum walking past. The professor barely noticed him, but Ethan greeted him anyway. "Good evening, sir." The professor nodded slightly without stopping. Ethan sighed and smiled to himself. "One day he'll see," he murmured. His quiet determination began to show results. The small solar model started generating more power than he had expected. He improved the alignment of panels, replaced a few wires, and finally made it strong enough to light a bulb steadily. The moment the bulb glowed, Ethan's tired face lit up too. He clapped softly to himself, feeling proud. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. He decided to refine his notes and submit a new version of his project to the university's science fair, though he knew it wasn't mandatory. He just wanted to try one more time. As the fair approached, Ethan continued to balance his classes, job, and project work. There were days when he barely slept, surviving on bread and tea. But even in those long nights, his hope didn't fade. Sometimes, when he walked past other students laughing and celebrating after class, he felt a sting of loneliness. But then he remembered why he was doing this. Not for grades, not for applause, but for something bigger. In his heart, he carried a small dream. To prove that great ideas could come from anyone, even from someone who had nothing. And though the world didn't notice him yet, his journey was only beginning. Somewhere in that quiet determination, a spark had been lit, one that would soon shine brighter than anyone could have imagined. The days passed slowly after the project results were announced. Ethan kept attending his classes quietly, sitting in the same back seat where no one really noticed him. While most students talked about grades and plans for the upcoming seminar, he stayed focused on his books. On the outside, he looked calm, but inside, he carried a small ache. He had worked so hard, but no one cared. Still, he didn't allow sadness to control him. He had learned long ago that if you stop trying, you lose everything. Every morning, he followed the same routine, woke up early, reviewed his notes, then headed to the cafe before his classes began. The smell of fresh coffee and the sound of clinking cups had become a part of his life. He often wiped tables with a quiet smile, serving people who didn't know he was also a university student. Some even left him small tips, which he collected in a small box to buy lab materials. One evening after work, he sat near the back door of the cafe, sipping a cup of tea. His notebook lay open beside him, filled with scribbled ideas and rough sketches. His hands were rough from washing dishes, but his mind was still sharp. "Maybe if I adjust the angle," he whispered to himself, drawing a new line across the page. The cafe manager, an older man named Mr. Allen, walked by and glanced at the notebook. "Still working on that project of yours?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir. I think I can make it better." Mr. Allen smiled gently. "You know, most kids your age spend their free time on their phones. You're different, boy. Don't stop. Ethan smiled faintly. I can't. I promised myself I wouldn't give up. The next morning, he went to the university lab early before anyone else arrived. The campus was quiet and a soft mist hung over the lawns. Inside the lab, the air smelled of metal and chemicals. He unpacked his small box of tools and began to rebuild his solar model piece by piece. The wires, the reused aluminum sheets, the small panels he had salvaged, all of it came together again under his steady hands. He worked for hours, testing the voltage, checking the current flow, and recording every number carefully. Sometimes the circuit failed and he had to start over, but each failure taught him something new. One afternoon, while he was deep in concentration, he didn't notice someone walk in. It was another student, Liam, known for being one of the top performers in class. "Hey," Liam said with a half-smile, "you're still messing with that junk project?" Ethan looked up briefly and gave a polite nod. "Just trying to improve it." Liam laughed. "Man, you really don't know when to quit. The professor already said it's too basic. Why waste time?" Ethan didn't respond. He had learned that arguing never helped. He simply returned to his work. Liam shrugged and walked out, still laughing. But that small moment stayed in Ethan's heart. Not because it hurt, but because it reminded him that people only see what's on the surface. They didn't see the reason behind his effort, the village, the darkness, the hope. That evening, when the sun began to set, he looked at his completed setup. It was small, maybe too simple for others, but to him it was a sign of persistence. When he connected the wires to the small bulb, the light came on instantly. It wasn't bright, but it shone steady. He stared at it quietly, and for the first time in weeks he smiled with real pride. He decided to test the model outside the lab, where the sunlight was stronger. The next day he carried the setup to the courtyard and placed it near the steps. A few students stopped to watch, curious. Ethan explained in his soft but confident voice how his design used broken mirror pieces to increase sunlight reflection, which made the panel produce more energy than usual. Some students actually seemed impressed. But before they could say more, Dr. Callum walked by. His expression hardened when he saw the setup on the ground. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply. Ethan straightened up. "Sir, I was testing my solar model in direct light." The professor frowned. "This isn't a playground, and that contraption doesn't belong here. Take it back to the lab before someone trips over it." The students around fell silent. Ethan nodded quietly, picked up his model, and walked away. He didn't say a word, but his hand shook slightly as he carried it back. That night he worked late again, making small adjustments. The rejection hurt, but he used that pain as motivation. If he won't see it now, one day someone else will, he whispered to himself. Meanwhile, the university announced a seminar where selected students could present research papers. It wasn't a competition, just a platform for showcasing work. Ethan wanted to participate, but he hesitated. His last experience with the professor still echoed in his mind. But deep inside, something urged him not to miss the chance. He stayed up the whole night rewriting his paper neatly, making sure his data was clear and his explanation simple. He borrowed a printer from another department late at night, printed his report, and attached photos of his model. The next morning, he submitted his name to the seminar committee. When the list of participants was posted, his name was nowhere to be found. Confused, he went to the office and asked one of the assistants about it. The assistant looked at him kindly and said, "Your topic wasn't approved." The professor thought it lacked academic depth. Ethan nodded slowly. "I see. Thank you." As he walked out of the office, the cold wind brushed against his face. For a brief moment, he stopped under the tall university gate and looked up at the sky. Maybe I really am out of place here, he thought. But then, almost immediately, another thought rose from his heart. No, I came here to learn, not to quit. He went straight to the lab again, continuing his work as usual. The lab assistant, an older man named Peter, had noticed Ethan's routine for weeks. "You're here every day," Peter said as he cleaned the tables. "You remind me of myself when I was a student." Ethan smiled shyly. "You also loved working late?" Peter chuckled. "I did, but I didn't have your patience. You've got something rare, real purpose." That small compliment lifted Ethan's spirit. Sometimes a single kind word can refill an empty heart. In the following days, Ethan refined his design further. He learned how to stabilize voltage using simple household items, improving efficiency by a few %. He kept all his results in a notebook, neatly dated and organized. He didn't realize that notebook would soon change everything. One afternoon, while Ethan was cleaning up the lab before leaving, he left the notebook on the main table by mistake. He had placed it there while packing his tools and forgot to take it. When he realized it later at his cafe job, it was already too late to go back. That same evening, the Dean of Science came to visit the lab for an unplanned inspection. He liked to walk around occasionally, checking the students' work. When he entered the room, he noticed the notebook lying on the table. Out of curiosity, he picked it up. He flipped through the pages slowly. The handwriting was neat, the data organized, and the ideas surprisingly thoughtful. There were hand-drawn circuits, formulas, and real observations. He stopped at a section where Ethan had written, "If we can make solar energy cheaper, even the poorest homes can have light." The dean smiled slightly. It was a simple line, but it carried sincerity. He continued reading for several minutes, growing more and more impressed. "Who worked on this?" he asked Peter, who was arranging equipment nearby. Peter thought for a moment. "Oh, that must be Ethan's notebook, sir. He's always here after hours, working quietly. Never complains, never shows off." The dean nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. Very interesting." He closed the notebook and placed it carefully on the table. "Make sure the student comes to see me tomorrow morning." Peter nodded, a faint smile on his face. He knew this could be something big for the quiet boy who had worked so hard in silence. That night, while Ethan served coffee at the cafe, he had no idea that his forgotten notebook had just caught the eye of the one person who could finally see his worth. The same work that everyone ignored was now in the hands of someone who truly understood what effort looked like. And without realizing it, his life had just begun to change. The next morning, Ethan walked across the quiet campus, still unaware of what was waiting for him. The sun was rising slowly, painting the buildings in a soft orange glow. He carried his backpack as usual, his notebook missing from it, though he hadn't realized yet. He felt tired after working late and barely sleeping. When he entered the lab, Peter, the lab assistant, smiled at him warmly. "Ethan, the dean wants to see you in his office," he said. Ethan froze for a moment. "The dean?" he repeated, confused. "Did something happen?" Peter shook his head. "No, nothing bad, just go." He said, "It's important." Ethan felt his heart beat faster. The dean had never called him before. He wondered if maybe he had broken some lab rule or left equipment switched on. Nervous but curious, he washed his hands, straightened his shirt, and walked toward the dean's office. The hallway leading there felt longer than usual. Students passed him chatting about their upcoming seminar, but he barely heard them. When he reached the large wooden door that read Dean of Science, Dr. Howard, he took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," a calm voice said from inside. Ethan stepped in quietly. The dean was sitting behind his desk, a kind-faced man with gray hair and sharp eyes. On the table, to Ethan's surprise, lay his old notebook. "Good morning, sir," Ethan said softly. "Good morning, Ethan," the dean replied with a gentle smile. "You left this in the lab yesterday." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, yes, sir. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I left it there." "That's quite all right," the dean said. He tapped the notebook lightly. "I had a look at it. Very impressive work you've done here." Ethan blinked in disbelief. "You read it?" "Yes," the dean said. "And I must say, your observations and method are remarkable, especially for a student working alone. Using recycled materials to improve solar output. It's creative, practical, and shows strong understanding. Tell me, how long have you been working on this?" Ethan hesitated, still trying to process the situation. "Almost 3 months, sir. I started with basic ideas, but I kept improving them after each test." The dean leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully. "And why did you choose this topic?" Ethan smiled faintly. "My village doesn't have regular electricity, sir. At night it's dark and students can't study properly. I wanted to find a cheap way to make light for families like ours." The dean nodded slowly, deeply moved by the simplicity of his words. "That's a noble reason, Ethan. Real science comes from compassion like that." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then the dean said, "Would you be willing to demonstrate your model for me?" Ethan hesitated. "Of course, sir. But it's not perfect yet." "That's fine," the dean replied kindly. "Bring it tomorrow afternoon. I'd like to see it in action." Ethan left the office with a strange feeling in his chest. For the first time in a long while, someone had looked at his work with genuine interest, not as a poor boy's effort, but as something valuable. As he walked across the courtyard, he couldn't stop smiling. The air felt lighter, the sunlight warmer. That night, he couldn't rest. He kept testing the solar model again and again, making sure every wire, every connection was secure. He adjusted the mirrors, cleaned the small panels, and rewrote his notes. He didn't have fancy tools, but his hands moved with care as if the model was something precious. When morning came, he skipped breakfast and went straight to the lab to prepare. Around noon, Peter came in to tell him, "The dean just informed the professor about your presentation. Both of them will attend." Ethan's heart skipped. "The professor too?" Peter nodded. "Yes, so make sure you show your best, son. This is your moment." Ethan thanked him quietly and kept working. He had mixed feelings. Nervous because of Dr. Callum, but hopeful because of the dean. At 3 p.m., Ethan stood in the seminar room, setting up his project on the demonstration table. The dean entered first, smiling encouragingly. Then came Dr. Callum, his expression as strict as ever. A few faculty members followed, curious to see what was going on. "All right, Ethan," the dean said. "We're ready when you are." Ethan took a deep breath and began. "Good afternoon, everyone. My project focuses on building low-cost solar panels using recycled materials. The goal is to create affordable power solutions for areas without steady electricity." He spoke slowly, his voice calm but firm. He showed how he used broken mirror pieces to reflect light onto the panel, increasing its efficiency. He explained how aluminum soda cans worked as conductors, and how the entire setup cost less than a single textbook. As he talked, the small bulb attached to his model started glowing. The light flickered, then grew brighter. The room fell silent. The dean leaned forward, impressed. "That's extraordinary," he said softly. Ethan continued, explaining the readings and results he had recorded over the weeks. "If we produce these in bulk using local materials, every family could afford at least one. It's not just science, it's change." When he finished, there was a pause. The dean began clapping first, a wide smile spreading across his face. "Brilliant work, Ethan. This is real innovation." The other faculty members joined in, their applause filling the room. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding. He had never heard applause for himself before. Dr. Callum, standing at the side, looked visibly surprised. He hadn't expected much from the quiet boy he'd ignored. Slowly, he too began to clap, though his face carried a mixture of pride and regret. Ethan bowed slightly. "Thank you, sir," he said softly. After the demonstration, the dean walked up to him. "You've done something special," he said warmly. "I want you to present this at the university's research fair next month. And don't worry about materials or expenses, I'll make sure you get full support." Ethan's eyes widened. "Thank you so much, sir," he said, his voice trembling slightly. As the room cleared, Dr. Callum lingered behind. He looked at Ethan's model again, then at the boy himself. "I underestimated you," he admitted quietly. "Your work deserves recognition." Ethan smiled politely. "Thank you, sir," the professor nodded. "Continue refining it. I'll review your updated report personally this time." After everyone left, Ethan sat alone for a moment, staring at his glowing bulb. The sound of the dean's clapping still echoed in his ears. He could hardly believe it had happened. For once, all his long nights, all his quiet sacrifices had led to something real. That evening, he returned to his small room, feeling lighter than he had in months. When he called his mother and told her what had happened, she cried with joy. "I always knew you would make me proud, my son," she said softly over the crackling phone line. "I'm just getting started, Ma," Ethan replied, smiling through tired eyes. There's still a long way to go. Over the next few days, the story spread around the campus. Students who once ignored him now greeted him warmly. Some asked for his advice, others wanted to see his model. Ethan remained humble through it all. He never bragged or looked down on anyone. He simply kept working, improving, and learning. One afternoon, the dean invited him again. "Ethan," he said, "I've spoken to a few sponsors who are interested in supporting student research. I mentioned your work and they'd like to see it." Ethan couldn't believe it. "Really, sir?" "Yes," the dean smiled. "But I want you to promise something. No matter how far you go, don't lose the heart that brought you here. Innovation means nothing without humility." Ethan nodded firmly. "I promise, sir." When he left the office that day, he looked around the campus differently. The same paths, the same classrooms, but everything felt new. People smiled at him now, and even Dr. Callum greeted him with respect. But deep down, Ethan knew his journey wasn't about recognition. It was about proving that silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the brightest ideas. That night, as he sat by his window, the city lights twinkled below. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line at the bottom of the last page. Dreams grow in silence. He closed it gently, knowing that this was only the beginning. The following weeks at the university felt different for Ethan. People who once barely noticed him now smiled when he walked by. His classmates, who used to whisper behind his back, began asking him for help with their own projects. Even the staff treated him with quiet admiration. But Ethan hadn't changed. He still wore the same faded blue shirt, carried the same old backpack, and still stopped by the cafe every evening after class. He didn't care much for attention. He only cared about improving his work. The dean's faith in him had given him something precious: confidence. Every time he stepped into the lab, he remembered the applause that had filled the seminar room. It wasn't the sound that mattered most, but the feeling that for once someone believed in him. Dr. Callum, the professor who had once dismissed his work, began observing Ethan's progress more closely. He would stop by the lab now and then, asking small questions about Ethan's data or design. His tone had softened. It wasn't sharp or cold anymore. It carried curiosity, maybe even respect. One afternoon, as Ethan adjusted his solar setup, the professor entered quietly. "You're still refining it?" he asked, standing near the doorway. Ethan looked up and nodded. "Yes, sir. The dean suggested I make it more efficient for the fair next month." Dr. Callum walked closer, his eyes scanning the model. "I must say, you've surprised me, Ethan. Your design is clever. You found potential in materials most people would throw away." Ethan smiled shyly. "I just wanted to make something useful, sir." The professor nodded slowly. "You've done more than that. You've reminded me what innovation really means." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "I may have been too quick to judge earlier." Ethan didn't know what to say. "It's all right, sir," he said softly. "Sometimes people just need a chance to show what they can do." That simple response struck something in the professor. For years he had measured students by their polish, their confidence, their family names, their appearances. But this quiet boy had proven that talent didn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispered through persistence. Over the next few days, the professor began offering subtle guidance. He helped Ethan review the mathematical side of his report and explained how to structure his data more professionally. For the first time, they worked together, not as teacher and ignored student, but as two people who shared a goal. When the day of the university research fair arrived, the entire campus buzzed with excitement. Booths were set up across the main hall, each one decorated with colorful posters and high-tech displays. Ethan's booth looked simpler than the others, but it carried an authenticity that drew people in. His small solar model stood proudly at the center, connected to a glowing bulb and a fan that turned gently under the sunlight coming through the glass ceiling. As visitors arrived, Ethan greeted them politely and explained his project. Some were surprised when they learned it was made from recycled materials. "You built this with scraps?" one student asked, wide-eyed. "Yes," Ethan replied with a grin. "If something can still work, why throw it away?" The dean stopped by with a group of judges from a national science committee. When they reached Ethan's booth, the dean smiled proudly. "Here he is, the student who reminded us all what true research looks like." Ethan bowed slightly. "Thank you, sir." The judges asked questions, examined the setup, and took notes. One of them, an engineer from an energy company, was particularly impressed. "You've managed to make solar power affordable," he said thoughtfully. "With some refinement, this could be revolutionary." Ethan's eyes lit up. "That's my dream, sir, to make it affordable enough for small villages." The judge nodded. "That's the kind of dream worth supporting." After they moved to the next booth, the dean turned to Dr. Callum and said quietly, "You've got quite a remarkable student here." The professor gave a small smile. "Yes, sir. I'm proud of him. More than I can admit." When the results were announced that evening, Ethan's name echoed through the hall. First place in the research fair. The audience erupted into cheers, but Ethan stood frozen for a moment, stunned. The dean called him to the stage, shaking his hand firmly. "Ethan, this award is not just for your idea. It's for your perseverance." The applause thundered around him. And as he looked toward the crowd, Ethan saw his professor clapping too, this time with genuine pride. Later that night, after everyone had left, Ethan returned to the now quiet hall. He stood before his small booth and touched the model gently. The lights of the empty room reflected off the mirror pieces he had used in his design. He whispered softly, "We did it." Dr. Callum walked in quietly behind him. "You should be celebrating," he said. Ethan smiled. "I will, sir. But I just wanted to see it one last time before packing it up." The professor nodded. "You know," he said slowly, "when I first saw you, I made assumptions. I thought confidence meant capability. I thought polish meant intelligence. I was wrong." Ethan looked at him calmly. "We all learn, sir. That's what teaching is about too, right?" The professor chuckled quietly. "You're wise beyond your years, Ethan. I hope you know that." A comfortable silence filled the room. For the first time, there was no distance between them, no judgment, no tension, just mutual respect. In the following weeks, things moved quickly. Ethan's project caught the attention of the National Science Board. They invited him to present it at a regional conference. The dean personally arranged his travel expenses, insisting that money should never stand between talent and opportunity. When Ethan told his mother about it, she cried again, laughing through her tears. "I always told you hard work never goes unnoticed," she said proudly. At the conference, Ethan stood on a grand stage filled with scientists, investors, and educators. He was nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. But when he began speaking, his voice carried calm confidence. He talked about real people, about villages without light, about children studying under candles. He explained how his small model could bring hope where darkness still ruled. When he finished, the audience gave him a standing ovation. The dean, watching from the front row, smiled broadly. Even Dr. Callum, who had traveled with him for support, felt tears prick his eyes. After the event, a journalist approached Ethan. "You've inspired so many people," she said. "What keeps you going?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Because I know what it feels like to be ignored," he replied. "And I don't want anyone's ideas to be lost just because they don't look impressive." His words spread quickly. The next day, local newspapers printed his story with headlines like, "Student's simple idea wins hearts and minds." Messages of support poured in from teachers, scientists, and even people from his hometown. When Ethan returned to the university, he found a small crowd waiting to greet him. The dean congratulated him warmly, and even the vice-chancellor shook his hand. "You've brought pride to this institution, Ethan," the dean said. "You reminded us all that true learning comes from humility." That evening, there was a small celebration at the university hall. The professors, students, and staff gathered around, sharing food and laughter. When it was Dr. Callum's turn to speak, he walked up to the podium and looked directly at Ethan. "There was a time I failed to see this young man's brilliance," he began. "I judged him unfairly. But today I want everyone to know, Ethan taught me something no textbook ever could. He taught me that genius often hides behind silence, and sometimes the brightest light comes from the simplest places." The audience clapped, and Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion. He had dreamed of being recognized for his work, but he never imagined that it would also heal old misunderstandings. Later, as the celebration ended, the dean approached Ethan quietly. "There's one more thing," he said. "A scholarship committee has approved your application. You'll receive full funding to continue your research. Congratulations." Ethan couldn't speak for a moment. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," the dean replied with a smile, "by showing us what real education means." When Ethan left the hall that night, the stars above the campus seemed brighter than usual. He looked up, thinking of his village, his mother, and all the nights he had spent studying alone. Everything he had gone through, every ignored idea, every sleepless night had led him to this moment. As he walked home under the streetlights, he carried nothing more than his small model in a cardboard box. But in his heart he carried something far greater, the quiet joy of knowing that even when no one listens, truth and effort eventually find their voice. Months passed, but Ethan's story kept spreading far beyond the university walls. What had started as a small class project had now become a topic of conversation among educators, journalists, and even environmentalists. Everyone seemed touched by the idea that something so meaningful could be built with such simplicity. But for Ethan, life didn't suddenly become glamorous. He still followed the same routine: morning classes, long hours in the lab, and late evenings sketching new ideas. The only difference now was that people saw him differently. His professors respected him, students sought his advice, and the dean often invited him to meetings to discuss future research programs. One crisp morning, as he was working in the lab, a letter arrived with an official seal. It was from the Ministry of Energy. Ethan opened it carefully, his heart racing. Inside was an invitation. He was to present his solar project at a national innovation summit in the capital city. The letter mentioned that top scientists, entrepreneurs, and government officials would be attending. He stared at the letter for a long moment, unable to believe it. When Dr. Callum entered the lab a few minutes later, Ethan handed it to him silently. The professor read it and smiled broadly. "This is wonderful, Ethan. You're going to represent the university at the national level. Do you realize what that means?" Ethan nodded slowly. "It means more people might see what's possible when we don't give up." "That's exactly right," Dr. Callum said warmly. "And this time I'll make sure you have everything you need. No shortcuts, no neglect, only support." For the next few weeks, the professor and Ethan worked side by side. They refined the design, tested new materials, and even created a more compact prototype. The dean personally arranged sponsorship for their travel and accommodation. Everyone in the university wanted Ethan to succeed. When the day of the national summit arrived, Ethan stood outside the massive convention center, holding his small box with the model carefully inside. The building was enormous, filled with banners, cameras, and scientists from across the country. He felt small among them, but determined. Inside, rows of booths displayed futuristic machines and expensive prototypes. Some students had sleek designs made with professional help, while others had large teams assisting them. Ethan had none of that, just his old model, his notes, and the belief that honesty in work mattered more than appearance. As he began setting up, a few participants looked at his display with curiosity. One young man nearby with a high-tech robot at his booth smirked slightly. "That's your project?" he asked. "It looks basic," Ethan smiled politely. "Yes, it's simple, but it works." The other student shrugged and walked away. But Ethan didn't mind. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to share what he had built from nothing. When it was his turn to present, the large auditorium filled with people, he walked to the stage with his model in hand, placed it on the table, and adjusted the microphone. The lights above felt blinding, but when he looked at the crowd, he spotted two familiar faces in the front row, Dean Roberts and Dr. Callum. Their encouraging smiles gave him strength. He began to speak, his voice steady and calm. "I come from a small village," he said, "where power cuts are a daily part of life. People use candles and old lamps to study and cook. I wanted to change that. So I built something simple, a solar system made from recycled parts. It's small, but it can light up a home." He demonstrated the model. The light bulb flickered to life under the beam of artificial light, and the audience leaned forward. He explained how each piece worked, how he had used scrap mirrors to reflect sunlight, and how discarded batteries could store energy for night use. When he finished, silence filled the hall for a moment. Then came applause, loud, genuine, and lasting. Reporters rushed forward asking questions. Scientists praised his practicality. One of the judges, an elderly scientist with years of experience, said, "Young man, this is what innovation truly means, solving real problems with heart and intelligence." Later that afternoon, when the winners were announced, Ethan's name appeared again. First place National Innovation Award for Sustainable Energy Design. The crowd erupted into cheers, and flashes from cameras filled the hall. Ethan stood still for a second, overwhelmed. When he looked to the front row, he saw Dr. Callum on his feet, clapping hard, his eyes shining with pride. The dean, too, stood beside him, applauding with the same warmth he had shown the very first day. When Ethan stepped forward to receive the award, the chief guest, a renowned scientist, handed him a golden plaque and a certificate. "You've proven that brilliance doesn't need fancy tools," he said kindly. "It only needs a determined heart." That evening, as the sun set over the capital city, Ethan sat by a window in his hotel room. The golden plaque lay on the table beside him, shining under the lamplight. He thought of his mother, who was probably waiting to hear from him, and of all the nights he had stayed up late trying to make his dream work. He called her right away. "Mom, We won, he said, his voice trembling. There was a pause, then her familiar voice filled with tears. I knew you would, my boy. I knew it. The next day, newspapers carried his story again. Village Boy wins National Innovation Award. One headline read. Photos of him holding his small solar model spread across social media. Messages poured in from people who said they were inspired by his journey. The university arranged a grand welcome for his return. Students lined the entrance, clapping and cheering as Ethan walked in with his award. The dean gave a heartfelt speech. Ethan showed us that talent has no label, and perseverance can turn any obstacle into opportunity. When it was Dr. Callum's turn to speak, his voice trembled slightly. There was a time I didn't believe in him, he said openly. But he believed in himself. And because he didn't stop, he taught me that every student deserves to be seen. Not for what they have, but for what they can create. The hall filled with applause once more. Ethan felt emotional hearing those words. He had never held any anger toward the professor, but hearing him admit it publicly meant a lot. Over time, the university partnered with a renewable energy company to help Ethan expand his design. Engineers worked with him to create affordable solar units for rural communities. A year later, the first shipment of these units reached small towns and villages, including Ethan's own. When he visited home, the people gathered around him, proud and excited. Children ran beside him as he walked through the familiar dusty lanes. His mother waited outside their small house, tears shining in her eyes as she saw him carrying a small solar unit. He installed it on their roof himself. When the light turned on that evening, the whole house glowed softly. His mother touched his arm gently and whispered, "You've brought light back home, my son." That night, as the stars stretched across the sky, the entire village gathered around the glowing houses. People clapped and cheered, calling Ethan a hero. But he didn't feel like a hero. He just felt grateful. To the dean who believed in him, to the professor who learned from him, and to the long journey that had tested his spirit. A few days later, back at the university, Ethan received an email from the National Science Board. They wanted him to join a research program abroad, a scholarship for young innovators. It felt like a dream too big to grasp. When he showed it to Dr. Callum, the professor smiled proudly. "You deserve this, Ethan," he said. "Go out there and learn all you can. Then come back and teach others the same way you taught us, with humility." Ethan looked down for a moment, overwhelmed. "I couldn't have done this without you and the dean, sir." The professor shook his head. "You could have, and you would have. We just finally opened our eyes." A week later, Ethan boarded a plane for the first time in his life. As he looked out of the window, watching the city lights fade below, he thought about everything that had brought him there. The rejection, the humiliation, the long nights, and the eventual applause. It had all been worth it. Months later, his solar design was implemented in several remote areas. His name appeared in educational journals not as a prodigy, but as a symbol of persistence. And every time he visited his village, he would sit with local children, showing them how to build small models from discarded materials. He never forgot what it felt like to be ignored, and he made sure no young mind around him ever felt unseen again. Back at the university, Dr. Callum kept a framed picture of Ethan's first solar model in his office. Below it, he had written a small note in his own handwriting. "Believe in those who are quiet. They might just light the world." And somewhere far away, under a bright sky, a boy who once sat in the back of the class had become the light for countless others, proof that even the smallest spark, when protected and believed in, can shine brighter than anyone ever imagined.